My name is Naomi Carter, and my parents funded my brother's future like it was a sacred mission, then looked me dead in the eye and said, "Girls don't need degrees, just find a husband." Here's the part that still burns. I became a surgeon anyway, and last month, at his engagement party, my father erased me in public. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, in one of those picture-perfect cul-de-sacs where every lawn is trimmed like it's competing for an award and every family smiles like they have nothing to hide. And if you've ever lived in a house like that, you already know the truth. The cleaner the hedges, the uglier the secrets. Our place had the two-car garage, the colonial shutters, the flagstone walkway my mom scrubbed like it was a church floor, and inside it had something else too, a silent ranking system that didn't need to be written down because it lived in the way everyone breathed around my father. My dad, Gerald Carter, was the kind of man who wore pale blue Oxford shirts like a uniform and spoke in conclusions instead of conversations. And he carried himself like life was a board meeting he'd already won. When he made CFO at a mid-sized insurance company, he bought a Rolex and wore it every day like it wasn't jewelry, it was a trophy, proof that the world was fair to the right kind of person. My brother, Lucas, was the right kind of person. I was a sweet girl, a good helper, a future wife, which is the polite way some families say, background character. In our house, Lucas got dropped off at school in my father's Lexus. I took the bus. Lucas got a math tutor the moment his grades dipped. When I asked for help, my father didn't even look up from his newspaper. He said, "You don't need that. Girls just need to study enough to get by." Lucas's baseball games were family events, chairs, snacks, photos, loud cheering like he was already famous. My academic awards were something my mother would mention later in the kitchen, quietly, like she was reporting weather. My mom, Sharon, was soft-spoken and constantly smoothing over his edges, the kind of woman who could turn a slap into a tap just by changing the story you told yourself about it. Anytime I questioned why Lucas got everything, she'd pat my hand and say, "Your father does this because he loves you. He's trying to protect you." Protect me from what? Exactly success? Independence? The embarrassment of a daughter who actually had dreams? And here's the part people don't understand unless they lived it. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't running wild. I was the kid who color-coded her notebooks, who stayed after class to ask questions, who got national merit letters before I even finished applying. I did everything they told you to do if you want a good life, and it still didn't count because I wasn't a son. That's the part that makes you feel crazy, like you're working hard in a game where the referee already chose the winner before the whistle. The summer before my freshman year, my mother made meatloaf for dinner, and my mother only made meatloaf when something important was happening, birthdays, promotions, announcements, like the meatloaf itself was a warning bell. I was 18, holding my acceptance packet from the University of Maryland, partial scholarship, decent package, but I still needed about 15 grand a year to make it work. And I remember smoothing the paper on the dining table, trying to keep my voice steady because hope feels dangerous when you've been trained to expect rejection. "I got in," I said.
With a scholarship.
"I just need help with the rest." My father picked up the letter like it was a bill, glanced at the header, and set it down next to his plate without reading a single word. "That money is for Lucas," he said, swirling his whiskey like he was deciding whether to sell stock. "Your brother will need a career.
He'll have a family to support someday.
You..." And this is the moment I remember like it's carved into my ribs. He finally looked at me, straight in the eyes, calm as if he was saying the sky is blue. "You don't need degrees. Find yourself a good husband." The room went silent in that specific way it goes when everyone hears something unforgivable, but nobody moves to stop it. Lucas was 14, hunched over his phone, pretending not to hear, which is the first lesson in how entitlement grows. It grows in the shadow of silence. My mother didn't speak. She didn't defend me. She didn't even flinch. She just kept chewing like if she acted normal enough, the moment would pass and we'd all pretend it never happened. That's how betrayal disguises itself as peacekeeping. It looks like calm. It feels like abandonment. I folded the letter slowly, slid it into my pocket, and said, "Okay, Not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment. I was never going to be saved in that house. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't throw things. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and started applying for jobs like I was drafting my own rescue plan. And I made a promise, so sharp it felt like a blade. I would never ask him for anything again. And I didn't. College wasn't a journey. College was survival with a syllabus. Job 1. Waitress at a diner 2 blocks from campus, 5 in the morning to 9, pouring coffee for truckers and retirees while my hands smelled like syrup and bleach. I'd run straight to my first class, hair still damp from a sink wash, with my apron stuffed into my backpack like a secret. Job 2, library assistant, afternoons and evenings, stamping due dates and shelving books while teaching myself organic chemistry between check-ins. Job 3, weekend tutor, the same service my father refused to buy for me. Now I was selling it to other people's kids to pay my own bills. I averaged 5 hours of sleep a night for 4 years. My friends would talk about parties, spring break trips, cute dates, and I'd smile like I was part of the conversation while calculating whether I could afford ramen or needed to stretch rice another day. I wore the same sneakers until the soles separated, and I glued it back together and kept walking because when you don't have a safety net, you become the net. I didn't go home for holidays. I told my mother I had extra shifts, which was true, but the bigger truth was I couldn't stomach sitting at that table watching Lucas open presents bought with money that could have changed my entire life. And here's something nobody tells you about being the overlooked daughter. You don't just lose support, you lose the right to celebrate yourself, because if you celebrate, you're showing off. And if you hurt, you're being dramatic. So you learn to swallow everything: pride, grief, hunger, loneliness, like your throat is a storage unit for emotions nobody wants to see. When graduation came, I finished top of my class, summa cum laude, 3.98 GPA, and I sent my parents an invitation anyway because even when you know better, some part of you still wants your parents to show up. My mother texted back, "So proud of you, sweetheart." And then, like a punch right after a hug, "But Lucas has an important soccer game that day. We'll celebrate when you're home." I graduated alone. A professor I barely knew shook my hand and said, "Wherever you go from here, you've earned it." I sat in my car afterward and cried for 10 minutes, not because I was sad I had no family there, but because I realized I'd been training my whole life for the wrong exam. I kept trying to pass a test my father never planned to grade fairly. Then I wiped my face, returned my overdue library books, and went back to work, because when you're invisible, there's no pause button for grief. Medical school came next, and here's where the story gets sharp, because this is where the lie started to build itself. I applied to 12 programs. 3 accepted me. I chose Johns Hopkins because the financial aid package was the best, and I pieced the rest together with loans, grants, work-study, and sheer stubbornness, like sewing a parachute while falling. For years of med school, 6 years of residency, 2 years of fellowship, 12 years of my life in fluorescent hallways, surgical scrubs, and adrenaline, training my hands to do what most people can't even imagine. I specialized in cardiothoracic surgery, the kind of field that eats people alive if they aren't built for it, and I watched colleagues burn out, switch specialties, quit, crumble, and I stayed, not because I needed to prove something to my father anymore, but because the moment you hold a human heart in your hands, you understand that petty family politics are small compared to what you're capable of doing in the real world. By 32, I was an attending surgeon at Johns Hopkins, board certified, published, respected, and the wild part is my family still acted like I worked some job at a hospital. That's what they called it. Naomi works at a hospital. Like I was moving bedpans in silence, while Lucas carried the family legacy. I stopped correcting them because I didn't want the argument, and because deep down I understood the real issue wasn't knowledge, it was permission. In their minds, I didn't have permission to be bigger than the story they wrote for me. I wore a simple gold ring with a Hopkins crest on it. Not flashy, most people didn't notice, but I noticed it every day when I scrubbed in because it reminded me of the truth. Nobody handed me anything, and nobody could take it from me. Then one Tuesday night at 9, my phone lit up with my mother's name, and she only called late when she didn't want my father to hear. "Naomi, honey," she whispered, voice tight like she was holding her breath. "I have news. Lucas is getting engaged." I leaned against my kitchen counter, staring at the tile like I could read the future in the grout. "That's great," I said. "Tell him congratulations." "There's going to be a party," she said, and I already knew the kind of party, because my father loved gatherings where he could perform his version of success. Bethesda Country Club. 150 guests. Your father wants it big. She hesitated, and when my mother hesitates, it means there's poison hidden in the sentence. "You can come if you want," she said. "But your father, he doesn't want anyone introducing you as a doctor or anything like that. He said you should just come as Lucas's sister. Keep it simple." Keep it simple. That phrase is how families bury you alive without leaving fingerprints. I felt the laugh rise up and die in my throat. "Did he send me an invitation?" I asked. Silence. Then, small and ashamed, "It was easier this way." "Easier for who, Mom?" "Easier for the man who tells himself he's a good father while he cuts one child off at the knees to lift the other onto a pedestal." I looked at my calendar. No surgeries scheduled. No on-call duty. My body wanted to decline. My brain wanted to protect me. But something deeper, something 18-year-old me would have recognized, wanted closure, wanted to see the machine up close, wanted to stop wondering if I was crazy for feeling erased. "I'll be there," I said. My mother exhaled like I'd agreed to keep her secret. "Just don't wear anything too attention-grabbing, okay? It's Lucas's night."
Of course, Mom.
It's always Lucas's night. I took an Uber because I didn't want valet questions or small talk or anyone peeking into my life. I wanted to slip in, say congrats, and slip out like the ghost they trained me to be. The country club looked exactly like money trying to prove it's tasteful. White columns, crystal chandeliers glowing through tall windows, landscaping so perfect it looked fake, and at the door a security guard checked a clipboard and frowned. "I'm not seeing Naomi Carter," he said. I almost smiled, because of course he wasn't. I called my mother, and 2 rings later she appeared, flustered, whispering to the guard, "She's with me. She's family."
Family.
That word felt like a costume that didn't fit anymore. Inside, the ballroom buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses and strings playing something classical in the corner, and my father stood near the entrance shaking hands like he was running for office. When he saw me, his face flickered, not warmth, not pride, just a quick calculation, and then he gave me a single nod like I was a distant coworker he didn't particularly like. No hug. No, you made it. Just a nod, and a turn back to his audience. A man beside him asked, "Gerald, who's that?" And my father's answer was smooth and deadly. "Just a relative." I walked past him without a word, and that's when I need you to pause with me for a second, because if you've ever been minimized by your own parents, you know how insane it feels to stand there with your whole life inside you and watch them talk about you like you're an inconvenience. And before the night goes any further, I want you to tell me something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Because I promise you this story is not just about me. It's about every person who worked themselves raw just to be treated like a footnote. Drop your city and your time in the comments. And if you've lived through this kind of family love, tell me, did your parents cross the line? Or is this just how some families get away with cruelty? I moved toward the bar, ordered sparkling water with lime because I didn't want alcohol clouding my head, and that's when I noticed her, the fiancé, standing near the center of the room in a cream dress that looked expensive but not loud, and she kept glancing at my hand like something was pulling her eyes there. At 8 o'clock sharp, the music faded and a spotlight hit the stage, and my father stepped up to the microphone with champagne in hand, Rolex glinting like it wanted attention too. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice warm and practiced, "thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate a special occasion." The room quieted. 150 faces turned toward him like he was the main event. "Tonight, we honor my son Lucas," he said, and then he smiled like he was about to deliver the line he'd rehearsed in the mirror. "The pride of the Carter family, our only successful child." And I'm telling you, that sentence landed like a scalpel sliding between ribs, clean, precise, no screaming, no chaos, just a quiet cut that makes you realize you've been bleeding for years. Applause rippled through the room. Lucas beamed near the stage, soaking it in, and I stood near the back, still as stone because if I moved, I might have broken something. I felt eyes flicking toward me. A few guests whispering, someone murmuring, "Doesn't he have a daughter?" And another voice answering, "I thought they only had the one son." And that's when I understood. He hadn't just ignored me. He'd erased me. On purpose.
Publicly.
Like deleting a file so nobody can ask why it doesn't exist. I set my glass down carefully, turned toward the exit, and that's when the fiancé started walking straight toward me, and I realized her eyes weren't just curious, they were haunted, like she'd seen me before in a place where people don't wear cocktail dresses and polite smiles, and as she got close, her gaze locked on my ring, and she said, softly but urgent, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, do you work at Johns Hopkins?" My stomach dropped, because in that moment I knew the past was about to walk into the room and flip the lights on. "Yes," I said, carefully, because something in her voice wasn't small talk. It was recognition trying to surface, and when she asked, "Are you a surgeon?" the noise of the room dulled like someone had turned the volume knob down on the world, and I finally looked at her properly, not as my brother's fiancé, not as a stranger in a cream dress, but as a memory. Pale skin under harsh aura lights, a chest that wouldn't stop bleeding, a heart that refused to quit even when everything else was failing. And I felt it click into place the way it always does when truth catches up with you. "Yes," I said, steady. "I am." Her hand flew to her mouth and her eyes filled instantly, and when she whispered my name, Naomi, like it was something sacred she'd been holding on to, I knew exactly who she was. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said, half laughing, half crying, and I shook my head slowly because surgeons remember faces differently, not from parties and polite conversations, but from the edge between life and death. And then I said it, "Claire," and she gasped like I'd pulled her back out of the water all over again. Claire Morgan. 3 years ago, 2 in the morning, a crushed sternum from a drunk driver running a red light, massive internal bleeding, parents crying in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and fear, 7 hours of surgery where I fought like hell to keep her heart beating, and when it finally did, when the monitor settled into that steady rhythm, I'd leaned back and felt that quiet relief surgeons don't talk about. The moment you realize you didn't lose someone today. "It's really you," she said, gripping my arm like she needed proof I was solid. "You saved my life." And before I could answer, before I could ground myself in the present again, Lucas appeared at her side, smile already strained, already calculating. "Hey, babe," he said a little too fast. "What's going on?" He looked at me, then back at her. "Do you know my sister?" And Claire's head snapped toward him so sharply it was almost painful to watch. "Your sister?" she repeated. "Lucas, you never told me your sister was a doctor." I saw it then. The panic flash across his face before he buried it under charm, the same way he always did when things didn't go according to plan. "She works at a hospital," he said quickly, waving a hand like he was brushing away dust. "Administrative stuff. Administrative." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly him, minimizing anything that threatened his story. Claire stared at him like he'd started speaking another language. "Administrative," she echoed slowly. "Lucas, this woman didn't file my paperwork. She opened my chest. She held my heart in her hands." People nearby were starting to glance over, curiosity prickling the edges of the room like static. Lucas leaned closer to her, lowering his voice, his smile turning brittle. "Babe, let's not do this here. There are important people around. We can talk later." And that sentence, that instinct to manage appearances instead of truth, told me everything I needed to know about who he'd become. "Later when?" Claire asked quietly. "After we're married. After we buy a house. After I find out on my own." Lucas shot me a look then, sharp and accusing, like I'd orchestrated this just by existing. "Naomi," he hissed under his breath, "can you not make this about you? It's my night." And there it was, the line I'd heard my whole life, translated into adult language. Don't be inconvenient. Don't disrupt the narrative. Don't remind anyone that the rules were rigged. "I'm not making anything about me," I said calmly. I answered her question. Claire didn't look at me. She was watching Lucas unravel. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked him, and when he didn't answer, when his silence stretched and thickened, the room leaned in, because people can smell a lie the way they smell smoke. My father appeared then, like a summoned demon, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the space. "What's going on?" he asked, voice low and controlled, the tone he used when someone embarrassed him in public. "Nothing," Lucas said immediately. "Naomi was just leaving." "I wasn't," I said, and my father's eyes snapped to mine, sharp with warning. "This is not the place," he said, meaning this is not the stage I prepared for you. "If you can't be supportive, maybe you should go." "Supportive of what?" I asked, and I kept my voice level because I'd learned long ago that anger was exactly what he wanted me to show so he could dismiss me as emotional. "Of being erased?" Claire looked between us, confusion giving way to something harder, something like betrayal beginning to form. "Mr. Carter," she said, polite but firm, "did you know your daughter is a surgeon?" My father smiled, thin and practiced. "She works in healthcare," he said, sidestepping the truth like it was a pothole. "But tonight is about my son." A man nearby cleared his throat. "Gerald," he said, "I didn't realize you had a daughter." And that's when my father said it, the sentence that burned itself into the room. "We're a private family," he replied. "Naomi chose a different path. She's independent. Some children want to be part of the family legacy. Others don't have much to contribute." I felt the air go cold, not because the words were new, but because they were finally spoken out loud in front of witnesses. Claire's face changed completely then, like a door slamming shut behind her eyes. "Contribute," she repeated softly. "She contributed to my being alive." My father stiffened. "Young lady," he began, and she cut him off without raising her voice. "You stood on that stage and called Lucas your only successful child," she said. "And you did it while the woman who saved my life stood 15 feet away. Do you have any idea what that says about you?" A ripple of whispers spread. Heads turned. People who had been sipping champagne now held their glasses frozen midair. My mother hovered on the edge of the crowd, wringing her hands, already trying to calculate how to smooth this over. "Claire," Lucas said, panic creeping into his voice, "please, you're misunderstanding everything." "Then explain it," she shot back. "Explain why you told me you were finishing your residency when your own sister is standing here actually board certified." The word residency hung there like a loose wire, and something inside me snapped into focus. Residency. I felt it then, that itch at the base of my skull that always comes when something doesn't add up. "Lucas," I said slowly, "where are you doing your residency?" His mouth opened, closed. "You know," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Downtown." "Downtown where?" "Which hospital?" I pressed, because suddenly I realized I'd never once heard him name one. My father cut in sharply. "That's enough." "Is it?" Claire asked, and she turned to me. "Naomi, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Does what he's saying make sense to you?" And there it was, the moment where silence would have been easier, but easier is how lies survive. "No," I said simply. "It doesn't." Lucas's face went red. "You always do this," he snapped, volume rising. "You always try to undermine me." "I didn't undermine you," I replied. "You did that yourself." Claire stepped back from him like she needed space to breathe. "I almost died," she said, voice shaking but steady. "When I woke up in the ICU, Naomi was there. She told me I fought hard and that I deserved my second chance. I've thought about her ever since. And now I find out she's your sister, and you never mentioned her, never mentioned what she did, never mentioned that the person who saved me was standing right here while your father pretended she didn't exist." The room was silent enough that I could hear the string quartet awkwardly stopping mid-note. My mother rushed over then, smile plastered on like a bandage. "Sweetheart," she said to Claire, grabbing her arm gently, "let me introduce you to some friends from the club." Claire pulled her arm free.
"No," she said.
"I want answers." And that's when my phone buzzed in my clutch, a vibration that felt oddly loud in the stillness. I glanced down without thinking, and my stomach dropped. A text from a colleague at Hopkins. "Hey Naomi, random question. Did your brother Lucas ever finish residency? Just saw him speaking at a pharma sales conference." I read it twice, then a third time, my pulse steady in that eerie pre-surgical calm. Pharma sales. Not residency. Not medicine. Sales. Everything aligned in a sickening click. I slipped my phone back into my bag, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need to weaponize the truth yet. The truth was already walking toward the light on its own. Claire was staring at Lucas like she'd never really seen him before. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. "Are you a doctor?" Lucas laughed, too loud, too fast. "Of course I am." Stop, she said. "Just stop." She turned to me again. "Naomi, can you look something up for me?" I hesitated for half a second, then nodded. I pulled my phone out, typed his name, added the company my colleague mentioned. It took less than 10 seconds. LinkedIn profile. Medical sales representative. 2 years. No MD license. No residency. No fellowship. Just a polished lie wrapped in family pride. I held the screen out to her. She stared at it, then at him, then back at the screen. "You lied to me," she whispered. Lucas reached for her. "I was going to tell you." "When?" she asked. "After the wedding?" My father stepped forward, anger radiating off him now. "This is inappropriate," he barked. "We're not doing this here." "You already did," Claire replied, eyes never leaving Lucas. "You did it when you decided image mattered more than truth." She turned to the room, voice steady but loud enough to carry. "I need everyone to understand something. 3 years ago, I survived a car accident because of this woman." She gestured to me. "She is a cardiothoracic surgeon at Johns Hopkins. She saved my life. And tonight, I watched her own family treat her like she doesn't exist." Murmurs erupted, no longer contained. A man near the bar spoke up. "Johns Hopkins? As in the Hopkins?" "Yes," Claire said. "That one." My father's face strained of color. My mother looked like she might faint. Lucas stood there, exposed, his story collapsing in real time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt oddly calm, like the moment after a long surgery when you finally step back and realize the bleeding has stopped. Claire took a breath. "I was supposed to give a speech later," she said, "thanking this family, talking about our future. And now I realize I don't even know who I'm marrying." She looked at me again, eyes shining with something like resolve. "Naomi, will you stay?" I nodded slowly. "I'll stay." And as she turned toward the stage, the room buzzing with anticipation and discomfort, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not because I demanded to be seen, but because the truth refuses to stay hidden forever. And as Claire reached for the microphone, I knew the next few minutes were going to detonate everything my family had spent decades carefully constructing, and there was no going back to quiet after this. The microphone squealed softly as Claire adjusted it, that brief shrill sound cutting through the low murmur of confusion like a warning siren. And in that instant, I saw my father stiffen the way men do when they realize control is slipping through their fingers. But Claire didn't look at him. She didn't look at Lucas either. She looked out at the room full of polished smiles and expensive watches and people who had been told a very specific story about this family, and she inhaled like someone, bracing themselves before stepping into cold water. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, voice steady enough that you'd think she'd rehearsed this, but I could see her fingers trembling slightly around the microphone. I was going to give a very different speech. One about love and gratitude, and how excited I am to join this family. A few people chuckled politely, expecting a sentimental turn. But something happened tonight that changed that for me, and I can't pretend it didn't. My father took one step forward, then stopped when several heads turned toward him, his public mask snapping into place too late. 3 years ago, Claire continued, I was in a car accident that nearly killed me. A truck ran a red light and crushed my chest. The doctors told my parents I might not make it through the night. The room quieted, attention sharpening. I survived because one surgeon refused to give up. She fought for me for 7 hours straight. She saved my life. She paused, letting the weight settle. That surgeon is standing right here. And she turned, pointing directly at me. The shift in the room was physical, like air pressure changing. People leaned, whispered, recalculated. Her name is Dr. Naomi Carter, Claire said clearly. She's a cardiothoracic surgeon at Johns Hopkins. She's one of the most skilled physicians I've ever met, and she is also Lucas's sister. I felt every eye in the room swing toward me again, and for a split second that old instinct flared, the one that told me to shrink, to lower my gaze, to apologize for taking up space. But I didn't. I stood there, hands steady at my sides, and let the truth exist without explanation. What shocked me tonight, Claire went on, was realizing that I've been engaged to someone for months and didn't know this. I didn't know because it was never mentioned. In fact, Dr. Carter was introduced to me as someone who works in hospital administration. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter ran through the crowd. I also heard Mr. Carter stand on this stage earlier and refer to Lucas as his only successful child. Claire's voice sharpened just a fraction. I'm trying to understand how a family can celebrate one child's supposed success while erasing another child's very real accomplishments. The word supposed landed like a dropped plate. Lucas took a step toward the stage. Claire, stop, he hissed. You're embarrassing everyone. No, she replied without turning. I'm telling the truth. My mother's face crumpled, her hands fluttering uselessly at her sides as she looked from me to my father, to Lucas, to the crowd that was no longer politely confused but openly curious. I didn't come up here to attack anyone,
Claire said.
I came up here because I don't want to build a marriage on lies, and I don't want to be part of a family that treats truth like an inconvenience. She turned to me then and held out her hand. Naomi, would you come up here with me? That walk felt longer than it was, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each step punctuated by whispers and sideways glances, and I could hear fragments drifting through the air like static. She's a surgeon? Why didn't they know? Johns Hopkins. I stepped onto the stage and stood beside Claire, the lights warm on my face, and suddenly I was back in operating rooms and conference halls and places where my presence wasn't questioned.
Claire squeezed my hand.
I wouldn't be here without her, she said, and I won't pretend otherwise. A man near the front cleared his throat. Gerald, he said, addressing my father. Is this true? Your daughter is a cardiothoracic surgeon. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then smiled tightly. She chose a different lifestyle, he said, the same deflection he'd used my entire life. We don't focus on titles. You seemed pretty focused on Lucas's, someone else muttered, not quietly enough. Claire took a breath. There's something else I need to say, she continued, and I felt a shift then, the sense that we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I also learned tonight that Lucas hasn't been honest with me about his own career. The room held its breath. Lucas laughed again, sharp and brittle. This is ridiculous, he said. You're taking her side now? I'm taking the side of the truth, Claire replied. Lucas told me he was finishing his residency. He told me he was becoming a doctor. She looked out at the crowd. But according to public records and a quick search, Lucas left medical training 2 years ago and works in pharmaceutical sales. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face went slack, then hardened, color draining from his cheeks. That's not true, he snapped. Lucas. All eyes turned to him. Lucas stood frozen, jaw clenched, then shook his head. It's not what it sounds like, he said weakly. I was going to tell you. When? Claire asked quietly. Lucas didn't answer. You told me you were saving lives, she said. You told me you were exhausted from overnight shifts, from difficult patients. You let me believe you were someone you're not. She slipped the ring from her finger then, the diamond catching the light for a brief, cruel second before she placed it in his hand. I can't marry a lie. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother made a small sound, half sob, half plea. Claire, please, she whispered. We can talk about this privately. You had months to talk privately, Claire said. You chose silence. She turned back to me, eyes softening. Thank you for staying, she said quietly. And thank you for telling the truth, even when it costs you. Lucas stared at the ring in his palm like it might explode. You're ruining my life, he said, voice breaking. No, I replied calmly. You did that yourself. He rounded on me then, anger flaring. You always had to be better, he snapped. Always showing off. I never showed off, I said. I just existed. That landed harder than anything else. My father stepped forward at last, climbing the stage with the stiffness of a man whose authority had just evaporated. This is enough, he said, voice shaking with fury. You've made your point. We'll handle this as a family. You already did, I replied, meeting his gaze. You handled it for decades. He stared at me, really stared, like he was seeing me for the first time without the filter of his expectations. You don't understand the pressure Lucas was under, he said. The expectations. I laughed then, a short, humorless sound. I understand pressure, I said. I worked 3 jobs through college because you wouldn't help me. I slept 5 hours a night for years. I put myself through medical school without $1 from you. I understand pressure better than you ever will. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. Claire stepped down from the stage then, moving past Lucas without another glance, and headed for the exit, her shoulders squared, her step steady. Lucas called after her once, then stopped, the realization settling in that there was nothing left to say. The party dissolved around us in slow motion, guests murmuring excuses and collecting coats, the string quartet packing up awkwardly, the illusion shattering piece by piece. My mother approached me hesitantly. Naomi, she whispered, eyes wet. I never meant for this to happen. I know, I said, and I did. That's part of the problem. She reached for my hand. I am proud of you, she said, voice trembling. I should have said it years ago. I squeezed her fingers gently. Thank you, I replied, and I meant it, even if it came late. My father stood a few feet away, silent now, watching the wreckage of his carefully curated image. We need to talk, he said at last. I looked at him, really looked at the man who had shaped my childhood with neglect disguised as discipline. When you're ready to listen, I said evenly, we can. And then I turned and walked away, past the toppled narrative and the stunned faces, out into the cool night air where my Uber was already pulling up, headlights cutting through the dark like a promise of forward motion. As I slid into the back seat and the doors closed, I felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph, not revenge, but relief, the quiet kind that settles in when you finally stop carrying a lie that was never yours to begin with. And as the car pulled away from the country club and its shattered illusions, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot, because the reckoning that matters most doesn't happen on a stage. It happens afterward, in the silence, when people have to live with the truth they spent years avoiding, and I could already feel the next wave coming. The morning after the engagement party felt unreal, like waking up in a stranger's house where everything is familiar but wrong, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every second from the night before, my father's face when the room turned on him, Lucas standing under the lights clutching a ring that suddenly meant nothing, Claire's voice steady while everything else shook, and I realized something unsettling. The moment itself was over, but the consequences were just beginning to.
Breathe.
My phone buzzed before I'd even brushed my teeth, a text from my mother sent at 6:12 a.m. that simply said, please call me, and beneath it another message sent 2 minutes later. Your father is beside himself. I didn't respond right away, not because I wanted to punish her, but because for the first time in my life I didn't feel rushed to manage their emotions, didn't feel obligated to jump in and smooth things over, and that alone felt like a small rebellion. I went through my morning routine slowly, methodically, the way I do before a complex surgery: shower, coffee, quiet, letting my thoughts line up instead of crash into each other, and what kept surfacing wasn't anger but clarity, a sharp, uncomfortable clarity that said this wasn't about one party or one speech. This was about a lifetime of decisions finally colliding in public. By 9 a.m. my phone had lit up with missed calls from numbers I recognized too well. My father's office line, Lucas's cell, my mother again, and a few unfamiliar numbers that I suspected belonged to relatives who had suddenly remembered I existed, and that made me laugh out loud in my empty kitchen. A short, incredulous laugh, because nothing exposes selective family loyalty faster than public embarrassment. I finally called my mother back while sitting at the kitchen counter, mug warming my hands, and she answered on the first ring like, She'd been holding the phone. "Naomi," she said, voice already breaking. "Are you okay?" The question almost knocked the air out of me because it was the first time she'd ever asked it without attaching a condition or an expectation. "I'm fine," I said honestly. "Tired, but fine." She exhaled shakily. "Your father hasn't slept. He keeps saying he doesn't understand how this happened, how everything spiraled." I stared at the sunlight pooling on the floor and thought, it didn't spiral, it revealed. "Mom," I said quietly. This didn't come out of nowhere. There was a long pause. "I know," she whispered, and in that whisper I heard something new, not denial, not defensiveness, but regret. She told me guests had left early, how whispers followed them out of the country club, how one of my father's colleagues had asked him point blank why he'd lied about me for years, and how Lucas had locked himself in his old bedroom like a sulking teenager instead of a grown man whose lies had finally caught up with him. "He says you humiliated him," my mother added softly. I closed my eyes. "No," I said. "I didn't. I told the truth. There's a difference." She didn't argue, and that silence was louder than any apology. 2 hours later, as I was heading into the hospital for rounds, Claire called me, her voice calmer than I expected, steadier even than the night before, and she said, "I just wanted you to hear this from me directly. I'm officially done. The engagement is over." I didn't ask if she was sure, because I could hear the certainty in her tone, the kind that comes after a hard internal decision has already been made. "I'm sorry it had to happen like that," I said. She let out a small, humorless laugh. "I'm not. If it hadn't, I might have married a version of someone who didn't exist." She paused, then added, "Your family is calling me nonstop." "You don't owe them anything," I said instinctively, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "I know," she replied, "but I wanted you to know something. What you did last night, standing there, not backing down, it gave me permission to do the same." After we hung up, I stood in the stairwell of the hospital for a moment longer than necessary, the familiar smell of antiseptic grounding me, and I realized how strange it was that my life inside these walls made perfect sense, while my life outside them had always felt like a negotiation. Rounds went on as usual. Patients needed me, charts needed reviewing, hearts needed repairing, and there was something almost comforting about the predictability of it, the way competence speaks for itself in spaces that value it. But even there, the ripple reached me. A colleague pulled me aside near the nurses' station and said, "Hey, I heard something wild last night. Country club, right?" I nodded, bracing myself. She smiled, not with gossip, but with respect. "Good for you," she said simply, and that meant more than she probably realized. By noon, the messages from extended family had shifted tone, some accusatory, some suddenly warm. One aunt I hadn't spoken to in years wrote, "We always knew you were special," and I almost choked on my sandwich laughing because no, they didn't. They knew when it was convenient. The real call came later that afternoon when my father finally reached me directly, not through my mother, not through guilt-laced texts, but a straightforward voicemail that said, "Naomi, we need to talk. Come by the house tonight." The phrasing was familiar, authoritative, like nothing had changed, and I stared at the phone thinking about how many times that tone had shut me down before I even opened my mouth. This time, I called him back. "I'm not coming tonight," I said evenly when he answered, his voice tight. "We need to talk now," he insisted. "No," I replied, heart steady. "We need to talk when we're both ready to listen. Tonight, I'm not." The silence on the other end was thick. "You don't get to dictate terms," he snapped. "Actually," I said calmly, "I do. You just haven't noticed yet." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline of setting a boundary I'd never been allowed to set. That night, instead of driving back to my childhood home like I'd done so many times to absorb their disappointment, I stayed in my apartment, ordered takeout, and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. The grief of realizing that the version of my family I'd been quietly hoping for probably never existed, and the relief of no longer pretending otherwise. The next day brought headlines I hadn't anticipated, not literal news, but the kind that travels through social circles. My father's boardroom whispering, Lucas's friends suddenly distancing themselves, the golden child image cracking under scrutiny, and I watched it from a distance, both detached and uncomfortably aware that the fallout wasn't over. Lucas finally texted me late that evening, a long rambling message filled with blame and self-pity, how I'd ruined everything, how Claire overreacted, how Dad was furious, how I'd always resented him, and I read it twice before replying with a single sentence, "I didn't lie, Lucas." He didn't respond. 2 days later, my mother came to see me unannounced, standing in my doorway with red eyes and a tentative smile like she wasn't sure she was welcome, and I stepped aside without a word, letting her in, noticing how she looked around my apartment like it was proof of a life she'd never fully acknowledged. We sat at my small dining table, hands wrapped around mugs, and she said quietly, "I should have protected you." I didn't interrupt her this time. I told myself keeping the peace was the same as doing the right thing. She continued, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But all I really did was teach you that your needs came last." The admission landed heavy and raw between us, and I felt something shift, not healed, but seen. "I can't change what I did," she said, "but I don't want to keep pretending anymore." I nodded slowly. "That's a start," I said. As she left, she hugged me tighter than she ever had, and I stood there afterward thinking about how accountability feels different from apology, how one opens a door while the other just gestures at it. By the end of the week, the story had fully flipped. People who once praised my father's parenting now questioning his values. Lucas forced to explain discrepancies he'd never expected anyone to check, and me, quietly returning to my routines with a new sense of gravity, knowing that the next confrontation wouldn't be public or dramatic, but far more dangerous, private, where narratives are rewritten and guilt is weaponized. Because if there's one thing families like mine excel at, it's damage control behind closed doors, and I could feel it coming, the inevitable sit-down, the justifications, the attempts to recast me as the problem again, and the only question left hanging was whether I would recognize the pattern in time, or get pulled back into it one last time, because the reckoning wasn't done yet, it was only changing form. The weeks stretched on with a strange, brittle quiet, the kind that settles after something breaks, and everyone pretends it was supposed to shatter that way, and I could feel the family machine recalibrating without me, conversations happening in rooms I wasn't in, narratives being revised, blame redistributed, and I knew from experience that silence in my family never meant peace, it meant strategy. I felt it first when my father stopped calling altogether. Not in surrender, but in calculation, because when he goes quiet, it's usually because he's rehearsing what he'll say when he believes he has leverage again. And that realization kept me alert in a way that felt familiar from the operating room, that calm vigilance before something goes wrong. Lucas resurfaced briefly in the form of a voicemail left at 2:17 a.m., his voice thick and unsteady, half angry, half begging, talking about how everything was ruined, how Dad was furious, how Mom wouldn't stop crying, how Claire wouldn't answer his calls, and how none of this would have happened if I'd just stayed quiet like I always did. And I listened to the message twice before deleting it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I recognized the pattern, the way my family turns consequences into accusations and accountability into betrayal. Work became my refuge again. Long hours, familiar rhythms, patients who didn't care about my last name or my childhood or who paid for whose tuition, only that my hands were steady and my decisions sound. And there was something grounding about that simplicity. But even there I felt the aftershocks. Colleagues asking gentle questions, nurses squeezing my arm in solidarity, a senior surgeon pulling me aside to say, "Families can be harder than any operation." And I nodded because he was right. Families don't follow protocols, they don't respond to logic, and they rarely stop bleeding on their own. The real escalation came 3 days later when my father finally requested a meeting, not at the house, not over the phone, but at his office, a glass and steel monument to control where he's always felt most powerful, and the invitation wasn't framed as an apology or a conversation but as a summons. "Come by at noon, we need to straighten this out." And I almost laughed at the phrasing, straighten this out, as if the truth were a crooked tie he could adjust and wear again. I debated not going, debated protecting my peace by staying away, but something in me wanted to see him in his own environment, stripped of the social buffer of a party, forced to face me without an audience to perform for. So I went, not because I owed him, but because I wanted clarity. His assistant looked startled when I arrived, ushering me into the corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and carefully arranged awards, the room smelling faintly of polished wood and old confidence, and my father stood when I entered, posture rigid, jaw set, a man preparing to argue a case he assumed he would win. He didn't offer me a seat at first, launching straight into it, talking about reputation, about how appearances matter, about how people were asking questions that made him look bad. And there it was, the Betrayal injury, not the favoritism, not the years of dismissal, but the public dent to his image. I let him talk, watched him pace behind his desk, listened to him frame the entire situation as my failure to understand timing and decorum, and when he finally paused, clearly expecting me to apologize or at least soften, I said quietly, "You're not angry because I embarrassed you. You're angry because people saw the truth." He stopped pacing, eyes narrowing. "You didn't have to do it like that," he snapped. "You forced our hand." I met his gaze steadily. "You forced mine when you erased me." For a moment, something flickered in his expression, not remorse, not empathy, but irritation mixed with confusion, like a man encountering a variable he hadn't accounted for. He tried a different tactic then, softer, almost reasonable, talking about how he'd provided for the family, how he'd made sacrifices, how his generation did things differently, how he thought pushing Lucas was protecting him from failure, how he believed steering me toward marriage was sparing me hardship, and there it was, the familiar rewriting of harm as care. "Do you have any idea how hard it was for me?" he asked, voice rising. "I grew up with nothing. Everything I built by being strategic." I nodded slowly. "And you decided strategy meant investing in your son and betting against your daughter." He bristled. "That's not fair." "It's accurate," I replied. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, the kind that exposes the limits of rationalization, and I realized then that he wasn't incapable of understanding. He simply didn't want to accept the cost of his choices. He shifted again, frustration sharpening his tone. "So, what do you want?" he demanded. "An apology? Money? Public recognition?" I almost smiled, because it revealed everything, his belief that worth is transactional, that repair comes in the form of gestures that restore hierarchy. "I want you to stop lying about me," I said simply, "to yourself and to others. I want you to acknowledge that what you did was wrong."
He scoffed.
"You're asking me to undermine everything I've stood for." I leaned forward slightly.
"No."
"I'm asking you to tell the truth." That was the moment I knew this conversation wouldn't end the way he expected, because truth is the one currency he's never been willing to trade in. He straightened, voice hardening. "If you think I'm going to grovel because you decided to make a spectacle, you're mistaken." I stood then, calm, unshaken. I didn't come here for groveling. I came to see if there was any point in continuing this relationship as it's been. He looked genuinely startled. "You don't get to threaten me," he said. "I'm not threatening," I replied. "I'm deciding." I left his office without another word, the elevator ride down feeling strangely light, like gravity had loosened its grip, and as the doors opened onto the street, I realized that for the first time, his approval no longer felt like oxygen. It felt optional. The fallout was immediate but quieter, my mother calling later that night, voice strained, telling me my father was furious, telling me Lucas was spiraling, telling me the family group chat had dissolved into factions, and for once I didn't rush to fix it, didn't volunteer to mediate, didn't absorb the emotional labor they'd always expected of me. "I love you," my mother said hesitantly, as if testing the words. "I love you too," I replied, and meant it, but love without honesty suddenly felt insufficient. Days passed, then a week, and the narrative outside shifted again, friends of the family reaching out to congratulate me on my career, to apologize for not knowing, to ask how they could support me, and while some of it felt performative, some of it felt real, and I allowed myself to accept the latter without bitterness, because bitterness would tether me to the very dynamic I was trying to escape. Lucas finally sent another message, shorter this time, less accusatory, asking if we could talk, and I stared at it for a long time, weighing the possibility that this was the beginning of accountability or just another attempt to recruit me into cushioning his fall, and I realized that my answer didn't have to be immediate. That urgency had always been their tool, not mine. I didn't reply that night. Instead, I went for a long walk, the city humming around me, and thought about how often I'd been taught that family loyalty meant silence, endurance, self-erasure, and how convenient that definition had been for those in power. I thought about the patients I'd seen over the years who waited too long to address a problem because acknowledging it felt scarier than living with it, and how healing almost always began with an uncomfortable truth. When I finally did respond to Lucas the next morning, my message was brief: "I'm open to talking when you're ready to be honest," and the ball was firmly in his court. That afternoon, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside it, a stack of old photographs my mother must have sent. Pictures of me as a child holding science fair ribbons, standing awkwardly at award ceremonies, smiling proudly despite empty seats behind me, and at the bottom, a note in her handwriting: "I see you now." And I sat on the floor surrounded by those images and cried. Not out of sadness, but release, the kind that comes when a story finally aligns with reality. The week ended not with resolution, but with momentum, the sense that something irreversible had shifted, that the old equilibrium was gone. And as unsettling as that was, it also felt honest, and honesty, I was learning, is destabilizing before it's liberating. I knew there were still conversations ahead, still reckonings waiting to surface, especially with Lucas, whose silence now felt heavier than his accusations ever had, and with my father, who had never been challenged this directly without an audience to protect him, and I could feel that confrontation looming, not explosive, but surgical, precise, and deeply uncomfortable, the kind that would determine whether any relationship survived at all, because the next step wasn't about exposure anymore. It was about choice, about who was willing to change, and who would cling to old power even as it crumbled, and that question was about to be answered whether any of us were ready or not. The silence didn't last, because silence never does in families built on control. It only stretches long enough for someone to decide how they want the story to end, and I could feel that decision forming somewhere behind the scenes, like pressure building in a sealed room, subtle at first, then unmistakable, the way the air changes before a storm. Lucas was the first crack. He showed up unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, standing outside my apartment building with that same defensive slouch he'd had since childhood, hands shoved in his pockets like he was bracing for impact, and the moment I saw him through the lobby glass, I understood that this wasn't about reconciliation, it was about survival. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but energetically, like the scaffolding that had always held him up had been yanked away, and he didn't know how to stand without it. I didn't invite him in right away. I let him talk in the hallway, his voice low and rushed, apologizing in fragments, blaming stress, blaming pressure, blaming dad, blaming expectations, and I listened because listening costs less than speaking and reveals more. He kept circling the same point, that everything had spiraled, that Claire was gone, that dad had cut him off financially, that the image he'd built was collapsing faster than he could patch it, and then finally, he said the part he'd been avoiding, that he needed my help, not emotionally, not relationally, but strategically, asking if I could talk to dad for him, if I could smooth things over, if I could explain to people that it wasn't as bad as it looked. I felt something settle in my chest then, a clarity that surprised me with its calm, and I told him no, not angrily, not defensively, just plainly, and the words seemed to hit him harder than any lecture could have. He stared at me like he didn't recognize the person standing in front of him, because for the first time, I wasn't absorbing the fallout of his choices. "You don't understand," he said, voice cracking. "He's all I've ever had." I nodded slowly. And I was what? He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked away, and in that moment I saw the truth he wasn't ready to face, that the same system that elevated him had erased me, and now that it was turning on him, he wanted me to fix it without dismantling it. "I can't protect you from dad," I said quietly. "And I won't lie for you." He flinched. "So, you're just going to let him destroy me?" I met his eyes. "I'm going to let you tell the truth." That was the line, the boundary, and he knew it, because his shoulders sagged as if he'd just realized there was no shortcut out of this. He left a few minutes later without another argument, and as the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the brother I never really had, relief that I wasn't playing my old role anymore. The ripple reached my mother next, not in confrontation but confession. A long call late one night where she talked without interruption for nearly an hour, unraveling decades of accommodation, admitting how often she'd chosen peace over protection, how she'd told herself that staying quiet was the same as staying kind, how she'd convinced herself that my independence meant I didn't need defending. And hearing it all laid out like that didn't absolve her, but it humanized her in a way I hadn't allowed myself before. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered at one point. "You don't have to fix it," I replied. "You just have to stop pretending it didn't happen." That sentence hung between us, heavy but honest, and she cried softly, not the dramatic kind but the exhausted kind, the sound of someone realizing that denial is more tiring than truth. She told me my father was furious, not outwardly, not explosively, but in that cold, strategic way he has when he feels cornered, and that he'd been telling anyone who would listen that I'd turned against the family, that success had gone to my head, that I'd humiliated him intentionally, and instead of reacting with a familiar sting, I felt something closer to detachment, because I recognized the maneuver, the attempt to reassert narrative control by casting himself as the victim. The difference now was that the narrative wasn't contained anymore. People had seen, heard, connected its he'd never intended to be visible, and that loss of control rattled him in a way nothing else ever had. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, not with shouting or ultimatums, but with an invitation to dinner, a neutral ground, a restaurant chosen for its discretion and prestige, as if ambience could buffer accountability, and I almost declined, but decided that avoidance would only prolong the inevitable. He arrived early, already seated when I walked in, posture stiff, eyes sharp, and we exchanged polite greetings that felt like formalities in a negotiation. He launched into it quickly, framing the past weeks as a misunderstanding amplified by emotion, insisting that my achievements were never dismissed, just private, that he'd always been proud in his own way, that I should have known that, and I listened, counting the deflections, the minimizations, the careful avoidance of responsibility. When he finally paused, waiting for agreement, I said, "You don't get to redefine my experience to make yourself comfortable." His jaw tightened. "You're rewriting history," he snapped. "No," I replied evenly. "I'm naming it." The tension at the table was palpable, the kind that makes waitstaff hover uncertainly, and he leaned back, studying me as if reassessing a chessboard. "What do you want from me?" he asked again, the same question as before, but this time edged with something like desperation. I took a breath. "I want honesty, publicly and privately. I want you to stop pretending you supported me when you didn't. I want you to acknowledge that you chose Lucas and justified it by diminishing me." He scoffed. "And if I don't?" The question was a challenge. "Then this is the relationship we have," I said calmly. "Occasional, distant, honest, and limited." He stared at me, incredulous. "You'd cut off your own father?" I shook my head. "I'm not cutting you off. I'm stepping back." That distinction mattered, because it placed the choice squarely where it belonged, not as punishment but consequence, and for a long moment he said nothing, fingers tapping against the table, eyes darting as if searching for leverage. "You think this makes you strong," he said finally. "I think it makes you ungrateful." I smiled faintly, not in amusement but recognition. I think confusing gratitude with obedience is how this started. The check arrived then, the mundane intrusion grounding the moment, and he reached for it automatically before stopping himself, a small but telling pause, as if reconsidering who he was supposed to be in this new dynamic, and I watched him wrestle with that identity in real time. We left without resolution, but something fundamental had shifted, because for the first time he hadn't bet me back into alignment with his version of events, and that unsettled him more than any argument ever could. The aftermath was quieter but deeper, the kind of slow reckoning that doesn't announce itself, Lucas spiraling between defensiveness and shame, my mother oscillating between relief and fear, my father retreating into himself, while the world he curated continued to look at him differently, and through it all, I felt an unfamiliar steadiness, not triumph, not bitterness, but agency. I began making choices without considering how they'd be received, only whether they were true, small things at first, declining invitations, setting time limits on calls, redirecting conversations when they veered into old patterns, and each boundary reinforced the last, like muscles strengthening with use. The most surprising shift came internally, the realization that anger had been a placeholder for grief, and now that I wasn't fighting for recognition, that grief could surface without overwhelming me, the grief of being unseen, unsupported, and underestimated, not as a single moment but as a cumulative erosion over years, and acknowledging it didn't weaken me. It clarified me. One evening, as I sat alone after a long day, I caught myself wondering not how to repair the family, but whether repair was even the right goal, whether some structures are so warped that preservation only perpetuates harm, and that thought didn't scare me the way it once would have. It grounded me. I knew the story wasn't over, that there were still revelations waiting, still choices to be made, especially as the truth about Lucas continued to surface and the pressure on my father intensified, because the next phase wouldn't be about confrontation or exposure, but consequence, about what happens when the systems we build to protect ourselves finally collapse under their own weight. And I could feel that collapse approaching, not as chaos, but as inevitability, the kind you can sense before. It arrives when the ground is already shifting beneath everyone's feet, and the question is no longer if things will change, but who will survive the change with their integrity intact. What changed after that wasn't loud or cinematic, it was procedural, administrative, and ruthless in the way real consequences usually are, because once truth enters a system built on image, it doesn't explode, it corrodes, and I started seeing the corrosion everywhere. It began with small things that didn't feel connected until they did. A canceled golf trip my father had bragged about for months, an invitation that never arrived, a board position he'd assumed was secure suddenly under review, and I knew without being told that whispers were moving faster than explanations. Reputation doesn't shatter all at once. It leaks, and the people who once leaned toward him now leaned away just enough to signal distance. Lucas called again, not desperate this time, but angry, blaming me outright, accusing me of sabotaging him, of poisoning the well, of enjoying this too much, and I let him vent until he ran out of words, because anger reveals more than apologies ever do. He said our father was different now, colder, harsher, watching him like a liability instead of a legacy, and I almost laughed at the irony, but stopped myself because there was no humor in watching someone discover the cost of conditional love. "You don't understand what he's like now," Lucas said, voice shaking. He looks at me like I failed him. I kept my tone even. That's how he's always looked at me. Silence followed, long and heavy, and for the first time, I heard something break through his defensiveness. Not remorse exactly, but recognition. The unsettling realization that the pedestal he'd stood on had been built out of my absence. Meanwhile, my mother began doing something I'd never seen before, telling the truth out loud, not just to me but to others, small admissions at first. She worked very hard on her own. We should have supported her more. Statements that seemed harmless until you understood how revolutionary they were in a family that thrived on quiet omission. My father noticed. He confronted her one night, voice raised just enough to remind her of old hierarchies, accusing her of undermining him, of rewriting history, and she surprised both of us by not backing down. "I'm not rewriting anything," she said calmly. "I'm just not lying anymore." When she told me that later, her voice still trembling, I realized this wasn't just my reckoning, it was hers too, delayed but finally unavoidable. The real turning point came not from within the family, but from outside it, because systems like ours don't collapse from internal dissent alone. They crumble when external validation dries up. A former colleague of my father's reached out to me directly, someone I barely remembered from childhood dinners, asking if we could talk, framing it as curiosity, concern, and professional due diligence. Over coffee, he asked careful questions about my career, my training, my timeline, questions that confirmed what I already suspected, that my father had been selectively editing reality for years, presenting a narrative that elevated him by diminishing me, and now that narrative was being audited. He always spoke about his son, the man admitted, almost apologetically. I didn't even know he had a daughter until recently. I nodded, not surprised. Most people didn't. That conversation didn't feel like vindication. It felt like closure, the final proof that I hadn't imagined my erasure, that it had been deliberate and effective until it wasn't. The calls to my father slowed after that. His tone changed when he did call, less authoritative, more probing, asking questions he'd never bothered to ask before, about my work, my schedule, my life, as if information could rebuild what had already been exposed. I answered honestly, but briefly, not out of spite but self-preservation. Because engagement without accountability is just another form of compliance. He finally asked the question I knew was coming, framed as concern but rooted in fear. "What are you telling people about us?" I didn't hesitate. The truth. He exhaled sharply. "And what exactly is that?" I paused. That I paid my own way. That I wasn't supported. That I built my life without help from this family. "You make it sound like we abandoned you," he snapped. I met his gaze across the table. "You did." The word landed with a finality that stunned him into silence, and in that silence, I felt something unhook, the last thread of obligation snapping cleanly. Around this time, Lucas made another choice, one that surprised me, not because it was noble, but because it was necessary. He stopped trying to salvage his image and started scrambling to build something real, enrolling in a certification program, taking a lower-paying role that actually matched his qualifications. And for the first time, I saw him struggle, without a safety net, not gracefully, not admirably, but honestly. He didn't thank me, didn't apologize, but he stopped blaming me, and that was enough to signal a shift. The family dynamic recalibrated around this new reality, my mother finding her voice, my father confronting limitations he'd always denied, Lucas redefining success in narrower, more realistic terms, and me standing slightly apart from it all, not detached but no longer entangled. I realized then that revenge isn't always about exposure or triumph. Sometimes it's about refusing to participate in the lie anymore and letting the truth do the damage it's meant to do. The cost of that refusal became clear when my father finally lost something tangible, a leadership role he'd assumed was untouchable, quietly reassigned, publicly justified as restructuring, and when he told me about it, his voice carried something I'd never heard before, uncertainty. "They don't see me the same way," he admitted, almost to himself. I resisted the urge to say I know, not because it wasn't true, but because empathy doesn't require self-erasure. "People adjust when new information comes out," I said neutrally. He looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to reconcile the daughter he dismissed with the woman standing in front of him, and I saw something flicker there, regret maybe, or fear, or both. But whatever it wasn't enough to rewrite the past, only to complicate the present. The final conversation before everything settled into its new shape happened late one evening, my mother on the line, voice steadier than I'd ever heard it, telling me she decided to stop smoothing things over, that she told my father she would no longer excuse his behavior, that she'd started therapy on her own, not to fix the marriage, but to understand herself, and I felt an unexpected swell of pride, not because she was finally choosing me, but because she was choosing honesty. "I should have protected you," she said again, softer this time. "I can't change that, but I can stop protecting the lie." That mattered more than any apology my father might never give. By the time the dust settled, the family looked different, smaller, quieter, less impressive from the outside, but more real in its fractures. I wasn't invited back into the center, and I didn't want to be. I had my own life, my own momentum, my own sense of worth that didn't depend on comparison or approval. The satisfaction came not from watching others fall, but from standing still while the ground shifted beneath them, knowing I'd already built something stable enough to hold me. And just when I thought the reckoning was complete, when the story seemed ready to rest, a new development surfaced, something none of us anticipated. A detail from the past that reframed everything and threatened to reopen wounds we thought were finally closing, reminding me that family histories don't end cleanly. They unravel in layers, and the next one was already starting to pull. What surfaced next didn't arrive as drama, it arrived as paperwork, because the past rarely comes back screaming. It comes back stamped, filed, and quietly undeniable. It started with an envelope forwarded to my address by mistake. Thick, official, my father's name typed neatly on the front. And the moment I saw the return address, I knew it wasn't meant for me, which made opening it feel like crossing an invisible line I'd spent years respecting. Inside were documents tied to a trust I'd never heard of, an educational trust created decades ago by my grandfather, earmarked explicitly for grandchildren's education, with language so clear it was almost cruel in its simplicity. Equal access, equal distribution, no gender distinction. No discretionary clause, just provision. I sat at my kitchen table rereading the pages while my coffee went cold, piecing together what this meant, not emotionally but mechanically, because betrayal becomes easier to process when you can trace it line by line. According to the documents, that trust had been active when I applied to college, fully funded, more than enough to cover my tuition and living expenses, and according to the disbursement records attached, every dollar of it had gone to Lucas. Not because I didn't qualify, not because the funds were insufficient, but because my father had authorized it that way, signing off as executor, rerouting money intended for both of us into a single narrative he'd already decided was worth investing in. I didn't feel anger first, I felt clarity, the kind that clicks into place so cleanly it almost feels merciful, because suddenly every conversation, every dismissal, every "we can't afford it," every lecture about practicality and marriage stopped being abstract and became deliberate. This wasn't neglect. It was choice. I called the number listed for the trust's managing firm, expecting resistance, bureaucracy, deflection, but what I got was discomfort, the audible kind that leaks through professional courtesy. The representative confirmed everything in a tone that suggested she'd been waiting for this call longer than she was supposed to admit. There were concerns, she said carefully. But at the time, the executor's authority wasn't challenged. Challenged by whom? I almost asked. An 18-year-old girl who'd just been told her future didn't require investment. The legal implications unfolded slowly, methodically, and I listened without interrupting as she explained my options: restitution, mediation, litigation, words that felt surreal attached to my childhood. But by the time we hung up, I understood something important. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about proof. I didn't rush to confront my father. I didn't call Lucas. I didn't even tell my mother, because this was one truth I wanted to hold on my own terms first, to examine without interference, to let settle into my bones. When I finally did bring it up, I did it over dinner, neutral setting, neutral tone, the documents laid flat between us like evidence in a trial no one wanted to attend. My father's reaction was immediate and unguarded in a way I'd never seen. Not denial, not outrage, but panic, the flicker of someone realizing the version of events they've rehearsed for years no longer applies. He tried to justify it quickly, saying it was temporary, saying he intended to make it right later, saying he believed Lucas needed it more, that it was a strategic decision, that he was thinking long-term. And I let him talk until he ran out of air, because every explanation only tightened the noose of his own logic. "You didn't think I'd find out," I said quietly. He looked at me, then really looked, and didn't argue. "I didn't think it would matter," he admitted, and that sentence told me everything I needed to know. Matter to whom, I wondered, because it had mattered to me every day I worked myself to exhaustion, every time I chose survival over rest, every moment I questioned whether I was asking for too much when I asked for nothing at all. My mother broke down when she learned the truth, not theatrically but completely, the kind of crying that empties you out rather than demands comfort, and she kept repeating that she hadn't known, that she'd trusted him, that she believed the story she'd been told, and I believed her. Not because she was blameless, but because complicity often hides behind trust until it's forced into the light. Lucas reacted last, and his reaction was the most complicated, a mixture of guilt and resentment, defensiveness and relief, because knowing the truth meant he could finally stop pretending his success had been earned cleanly, but it also meant acknowledging that his head start came at my expense. "I didn't ask for this," he said, and I nodded, because that was the one true thing he'd said in a while. "No," I replied, "but you accepted it." The aftermath wasn't explosive. It was procedural, lawyers speaking to lawyers, documents reviewed, options weighed. And through it all my father shrank, not physically but psychologically, reduced from authority to liability, his decisions no longer unquestioned, his judgment no longer assumed. I chose not to pursue litigation, not because he didn't deserve it, but because I didn't need a court to validate what I already knew, and because dragging it out would have tethered me to him longer than I was willing to tolerate. Instead, I requested restitution in the simplest form, acknowledgement and rebalancing, not just financial but factual, a written correction submitted to the trust's records, a formal admission that the distribution had been unequal and unauthorized in spirit, if not in law. He resisted at first, arguing about appearances, about legacy, about what people might think. And that's when I finally said the thing I'd been holding back for years. "You've spent your entire life worried about what people think of you," I told him, "and never once about what I think of myself." That landed harder than any accusation could have. The correction was filed. The trust records amended. A check arrived weeks later. Not life-changing money, not enough to retroactively soften the years I'd struggled, but enough to symbolize something far more important: acknowledgement without fanfare, restitution without reconciliation. I deposited it without ceremony and went back to my life, because closure doesn't announce itself. It settles quietly when you stop waiting for more. The family dynamic didn't heal. It recalibrated into something smaller and more honest: fewer calls, fewer expectations, fewer performances, and for the first time, I felt no urge to fill the silence. My father tried once more to regain footing, inviting me to lunch, speaking carefully, almost deferentially, as if recalculating his role, and I listened, not unkindly, but without the hunger I once had for his approval. When he asked if we could start fresh, I didn't say yes or no. I said, "We'll see." Because accountability doesn't earn immediate forgiveness. It earns the right to wait. The strangest part was how little I thought about revenge once the truth was out, because vindication isn't loud when it's real. It's grounding. It steadies you instead of inflating you, and what I felt wasn't triumph but release. The end of a question I'd been asking since I was 18. Why wasn't I worth it? I was. I always had been. The final realization came not from any family interaction but from a conversation with myself one night, alone, replaying the years not with bitterness but with perspective, understanding that their betrayal had shaped me but not defined me, that my resilience wasn't a gift they'd given me but a skill I developed in their absence, and that while the story had started with injustice, it didn't have to end with fixation on it. As I stood at my window, looking out over a city I'd chosen, a life I'd built, a future that felt wholly mine, I understood that the greatest consequence of their choices wasn't my suffering, it was their loss, because they'd missed knowing me when I was becoming, and now they only had access to the finished version, self-contained, self-defined, and no longer waiting. And just as that thought settled, my phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected, a name I hadn't seen in years, a question that hinted at yet another layer of this story I thought I'd finished unpacking, reminding me that some truths wait patiently for the moment you're strong enough to hear them, and the next one was already asking to be let in.